Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and I'm excited about today's episode. We'll be doing a Caribbean-inspired recipe right from the 18th century, Pepperpot. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. This recipe comes from The Lady's Assistant, Charlotte Mason, 1777. This is an English cookbook, but it has this obviously Caribbean-inspired pepperpot recipe. To make pepperpot, to 3 quarts of water, put in a small cabbage, 2 large handfuls of spinach, a head of lettuce, 2 or 3 onions, a little thyme. Cut them very small and let them stew. With 2 pounds of mutton till they are quite tender. Boil with them some little dumplings made of flour and water and a piece of pork, a little salted. A half an hour before it's taken up, put in a lobster or a crab, picked very small and clean from the shell, with a little salt and cayenne pepper. So this pepperpot is really a take on a 18th century pepperpot made in the West Indies and then sort of translated into the English context. You can imagine that Charlotte Mason, the author of this particular cookbook, she didn't go to the West Indies and watch pepperpot being made, and she probably never ate a West Indian pepperpot, but someone came from the West Indies and explained this dish and maybe made it so that she had a chance to sort of interpret it. So we have an interpretation, an 18th century interpretation of an 18th century pepperpot. Probably nothing like a pepperpot is made today, but we're gonna make this recipe. We are gonna tweak it a little bit. It seems like she's very light on the pepper of the pepperpot, so we'll play with that a little bit. First off though, we've got a lot of greens here. I've got some spinach, we've got a cabbage that we're gonna cut up a little bit. We've got collard greens and a little bit of lettuce. We're gonna chop those up nice and small and get them going in our pot right away. Let's add 2 onions diced up nice and fine to add into our greens. So the meat portion of this that we're going to put in today is pork. It's fresh pork. The recipe called for mutton. It was probably an inexpensive cut for the time period. She also calls for a little bit of salt pork. We've got an opportunity here to put in whatever we please here. You could put in some beef, like stew beef, something similar to that. Right here, I've got some pork already diced up into nice smaller pieces. That looks good. It's boiling up. We might leave that boil for half an hour or so, but right now we're gonna work on our hard dumplings. That's the next part of this recipe. She doesn't say exactly when to toss these in, so we're gonna make them up right now. We'll probably let that boil for an hour, 45 minutes, and then we'll toss these in and let them cook for a little bit. But let's make them up now. Super simple. I've got flour here, and I'm just gonna toss in a good bit of flour. I don't know, maybe I have 12 ounces of flour. I'm gonna add just a touch of salt to that. That looks good. And now water, and I'm gonna make this up into a hard paste. It's just flour, salt, water. Add enough. Okay, it's a nice stiff paste. That's what we're looking for. We're just gonna tear it off into, say, walnut-sized little balls. Roll those up like that. There are hard dumplings. We're gonna make sure they're all sealed up. Sometimes they don't have quite, we wanna have a consistency so it all locks together and doesn't wanna fall apart at all, right? That's our dumpling. These are so simple and they show up in a lot of these kinds of soups and stews. If you want some other kind of filler in there, really, really common. This looks really good. It's been slow boiling about an hour, hour and a half. The meat is wonderful and tender. The other things haven't broken down too much, so I don't want to let it cook too long. Next up, in the recipe, it says a half hour before serving or half hour before you take it up, you're supposed to put in either some lobster or some crab meat. And it says that it should be all picked, you know, fine. We don't want any shell, we don't want any big chunks. This should be a fine crab meat here. And remember, in the time period, that lobster and crab were probably fairly inexpensive meats here. So this isn't necessarily a super fancy way to fix it up, at least in the 18th century. It might be today. So let me put the crab meat in. And now we get to the namesake of a pepper pot. Let's talk about the pepper. This isn't black pepper or white pepper that's being used in this. It's cayenne pepper, sometimes called Guinea pepper because it came from the Guinea coast of South America. That's what we're gonna put into this. We've got a little bit of salt as it calls for, and then it says cayenne pepper. Does it mean a little bit of cayenne pepper or does it mean a lot? Well, that's up to you, isn't it? Let me tell you, this smells great, and I don't know if I've had anything quite like this. Can't wait to try this out. Lots of greens in here, lots of greens. And it's got pork, and it's got crab meat, and it's got the dumplings. So there's a lot of stuff going on in here. Let me find a little bit of the crab meat. There we go. Yes, yes. And I think I put in just the right amount of cayenne. Definitely a pepper pot, not just a, you know, a stew. We've got more things to try out. The greens, we want some other textures in there. We have the dumpling. A little bit of pork. This is great. It may not be exactly like a pepper pot that you know, but it is so good. This really, really interesting 18th century English interpretation of a pepper pot. This has been so much fun, this Caribbean inspired dish with, just this right amount of kick, you know. If you want a very similar episode, make sure to check out this Michael Twitty episode where we talk about barbecue.